Hello! Last time we looked at creating the back end of this Wordle game. So in this part 2 of the tutorial, what we're going to look at is the front end and making Wordle look like Wordle. The version of the file that we get to by the end of this video is available for download. The link is in the video description. Again, this is quite a long one, so let's get started. So first of all, let's create a new tab and let's just call this Wordle. I'm going to get rid of the grid lines, and then as a reference I'm going to bring in a picture of the Wordle board just to see what we're trying to create here. So this can be our reference for what we're trying to make. So let's first of all get this drawn out. We've got essentially two different sort of shapes here. We've got the square shapes for the letters grid, and then we've got the slightly rounded shapes for the QWERTY keyboard below. Okay, so first of all, let's go insert, and we'll just pull in a standard rectangle. I'm going to try and get this to a similar sort of size, probably about like that. And then to start with, let's have no fill, and I think we'll just use a light outline. And then the other changes I'm going to make to this shape, going to format shape, I'm going to say for the properties we're going to say don't move or size with cells. That just makes sure that if any cells do get resized, it does not morph the shape itself out of size. Any changes to the sizing of cells has no effect on the shape itself. Secondly, let's go to the text options, and I'm just going to remove any margin. And let's see how that looks with text inside it. So let's use an A. And if we go to home, we'll set it to black, we'll set it to be center aligned on both axes. I'm going to use Aptos display text. Make it bold, and let's try and get it up to a similar sort of size. That's probably about right. And then finally, before copying this across the entire grid, I'm going to go to shape format and selection pane. I'm just going to start naming it. So we're going to say we're going to have the row number and the column number separated by an underscore. So the first square will be 1, 1, then we'll go 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, etc. And then, for example, this chalk row that you see here would be 4, 1, 4, 2, 4, 3, 4, 4, 4, 5. That just allows us to easily reference the numbers numerically within the code, and you'll see how that looks and works later on. So for now, let's just copy these out so that we're creating this full grid. I'm just holding Control and Shift while I drag there, and I'll speed this up for the rest of the grid. So we've now got our 6 rows of 5 letters. The spacing actually there is not too far off. To make sure we're exactly aligned, all I'm going to do is go to Shape Format, Align, and then distribute these top rows horizontally. You can see things moved very minimally there. And then I'm going to move this bottom letter up slightly, just to reduce the overall gap. And then I'm going to use the align vertically for this row, and then I'm just going to true up the rest of the grid in line with this. Okay, so we've got a pretty good grid there. The next thing we'll create is the QWERTY keyboard. So I'm going to take a copy of these, and this time I'm just holding Control to move it down. Obviously these are somewhat smaller, so let's move the size down probably to a 14, and then I'm going to go Shape Format, Edit Shape, and I'm going to change this to a rounded rectangle, and I'm going to make this slightly smaller. Now for naming this one, I'm going to switch this to key and then Q. So each of our keys is going to be named in that way. So the front 3 letters will be key, and it will be followed by the letter or the function that the key is. Again, for the colouring here, let's go with, I think, no outline. And then the fill, let's go with this one here. And then obviously the lettering is white. And in fact, actually, because we're working on a white background, let's leave the lettering here as black. Okay, and then in exactly the same way, I'm going to copy this out and create the full keyboard. I'll speed this up to save you the pain. Okay, and then the final thing to do here is going to be to rename everything. Okay, so I think that pretty much does it for us. And let's create a new module, and we'll call this buttons. And let's create a function for a key click. And this is just going to be the action for clicking keyboard keys. So first of all, let's get the name of the key that's been clicked. So we're going to set the key name. We're going to take application.caller. That will get us the name of the button that's been pressed. And then we actually want to remove the first 3 characters to get the rest of the key name, which will either be a letter or it will be enter or delete if those buttons have been clicked. So the key name is going to equal the right hand side of key name, and we're going to take the length of key name -3. So that effectively will remove the front 3 characters from key name. So now we can check which key has been pressed and call our functions accordingly. So if the key name equals delete, then we'll do the delete functionality. Else if the key name equals enter, then do the enter functionality. And finally, otherwise we're going to be clicking a letter, so we'll do the letter functionality. Now for the letter functionality, let's create a new function, and let's just call this, we'll call it type letter, and we'll give it as an argument key name. So now we want to create this type letter function. I'm going to create a new module, and this module is going to control everything that's part of the front end, the UI. So let's call this module UI. And we're going to create a function called type letter that will take in the letter as a string. And this is just the action when a letter is typed. So we need 2 things when a letter is typed. We need to know which row it's getting typed onto and in which column it's getting typed into. Now if we go back to our calcs page, we know what the row is because this is maintained as we type through. It's automatically updated to say what row we're on. So when we're on row 9 of the calculation page, we know that we're on row 1 of the front end page. And in the same way, when we're on row 10, we know that we're row 2. So essentially, there's an 8 difference between the row this says and the row we want to output to on the front page. What we don't know at the moment is the column. So let's add in a second one here, and we'll call it column. And really we want this to automatically work out what column we are in. So let's think about how we would do that. We want to count how many letters have already been used. So if, for example, 2 have been used up, we want to say that we're on column 3. And the way that we can do that, if we say count A, and then give it a range, count A will tell us how many blank cells there are in that range. Count A will tell us how many non-blank cells there are in a range. So this will be 2. So really we need to add 1 on to count A to give us the next column that we're on. So now if we were to say A, I, we've done 4, we're on column 5, and we'll know that when this gets to 6, we're out of space. So the key click will no longer do anything. Now obviously at the moment we're just referencing A9. This is not dynamic. So we need to make sure that this 9 here is referencing this row. And the way that we can do that in Excel is using the indirect formula. So if we add indirect in here, we can then put the A and then an ampersand, and then we can reference a cell within a range. And again, we can say ampersand, and then we'll put that up to the E. And again, we can reference this. And then we just need the closing brackets. And that should do it for us. So now, if we were to make this guess, we'll see that the row will automatically go to 10 because we've got that in the code. Column is now looking at row 10. So it's now looking at the right place. So if we start typing in here, it will automatically update, and that's exactly what we want. Okay, so let's click new on here. So it resets it back to row 9. It'll automatically reset it to column 1. And let's go back to the code and start using these numbers. So let's have a variable called guessLetter. And that's going to be an integer, and one called guessRow, also as an integer. And we'll just assign those to be those 2 values from the calculation page. So that's going to be guessLetter is going to equal calcs.range, and we know that's H9, sorry, H10 for the letter. And the guessRow is exactly the same, but H9. We then want to say, okay, if the guessLetter is less than 6, then do something, otherwise we're going to do nothing. Because we know once we get to 6, all the letters for that row have been guessed, so the only thing the user should be able to do is delete or enter. They can't click any more letters, or clicking a letter has no other effect. So if we are going to do something, the 2 things we want to do, we want to paint the letter to the board, and we also want to add the letter to the calcs page. So first of all, painting the letter to the board, we want to reference the relevant shape here. So if we are on row 9, column 1 on the calcs page, that is going to equate to the very first letter. And we know that the way we've named this is row underscore column. So 9, 1 from the calcs page is the equivalent of 1 here. So we need to take that 9, we need to take 8 off the row number for it to correctly reference. So let's think about how we write that in. We reference the sheet, so it's Wordle.shapes, and the shape that we want to reference, effectively this is the shape that we want to reference. So to create this from our code, obviously we can leave the underscore in here, and we want to say guess row -8, and we use the ampersand to link it to this text, and then guess letter. So that should give us 1_1. And then to assign the actual value or the text to this shape, we use textFrame2 dot text range dot text, and then we can just assign that to the guess letter. Oh, sorry, the letter rather than the guess letter. So the letter is the letter that we've been given as the argument for this function up at the top here. That should paint the letter to the board correctly. And then adding the letter to the calcs page. For this one, it's a bit more simple because we've already got the 9 and the 1. So we can just say calc.cells. And this one will be guess row, guess letter, dot value equals letter. So obviously these will need to be blank, and we'll have a look at how to clear this board in a second. But for now, let's just say we were going to start with the letter P. First thing, actually, we need to assign that macro, that key click macro, to every single one of these keys. I'm just going to highlight them all, right click, assign macro, and we'll assign the key click. So now that they've all got that functionality associated with them, let's say we were going to do P, L, A, N, E. Now it's correctly assigned it here. Let's check that it's correctly assigned it on the calculations, and it has. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do, let's have a look at what the delete key will do, because this is a very similar functionality as pressing one of the other keys. So rather than type letter, let's just copy this entire function, and we'll say delete letter. And this one does not need to take in any argument. And this is, so in exactly the same way, we need to get the guess letter and the guess row that we're on. And for this one, we actually want to say if the guess letter is greater than 1, because if the guess letter is 1, that means you're on the first column, there's nothing to delete. So as long as the guess letter is greater than 1, we want to remove the letter from board. And we want to remove the letter from the calculations. So this first one, removing the letter from the board, is going to be exactly the same, except we are going to say set it to be nothing, and rather than removing the letter that we're on, we're going to remove the letter previously. Because if we're on column 3 is the empty column, and pressing the delete button we'll want to remove the value from column 2. So it's going to be guess letter -1, and then exactly the same for the calculations, guess letter -1, and the value of nothing. And then if we go back to our buttons section, we can now add in this functionality. So let's call delete letter, and that is in the wrong section. So I'm going to move that back up to the delete part. So now let's see if this works. Delete takes us back 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now it should do nothing, which is correct. And in the same way as if we try and type a letter when we get to the end, again, nothing happens. So finally, let's now look at what happens when you click the Enter key. So we've actually done most of the work for the enter key, for the guess at least, already on the calculations page. So if we go back to our code, and let's have, say, enter key, and this is the action when enter key is clicked. Now if we go back and have a look at our game functionality and our make guess function, really this is what happens when the enter button is pressed. So let's copy this to start with, and then let's see what changes we need to make. So we've got a game status variable. We're calling check guess on the row that we're on, which is correct. And the game status remains as check game status, which is all fine. So really none of this needs to change in terms of how the back end works. What we do need to add in is what happens visually on the front end when these buttons are pressed. And we also want to make sure that this enter key can only be activated once all 5 letters have been entered. So let's do that to start with. We can say if calcs.range, and we're going to look at h10, which is which column we're on. As long as that equals 6, then we can go ahead with all this stuff. Otherwise, the enter key is just going to do nothing. So we'll just put an end if, no else. The enter key won't do anything unless all of the letters in the guess have been put in. Secondly, let's think about what else needs to happen when you enter a guess here. One by one in Wordle, the colours change within the letters to let you know whether you've got it right or wrong. So really we want to paint these squares based on what result we've got here. So let's guess here. And you can see this one would be grey, grey, yellow, grey, grey. So let's create a paint letter functionality here. And this is going to take in a row, a column or a letter number, and a result. And with the result is going to be a 0, a 1 or a 2, as per the result grid on our calculations page. So this is to paint the given row and letter with the given result. So first of all, on our Wordle page, we're going to set the lettering to white, because whatever colour, whether it's grey, green or yellow, the background is, the forecolour is always white. So let's do that first of all. And again, we'll say Wordle.shapes, and then we'll reference our shape. So that's going to be row, then underscore and letter. And obviously we need to make sure here that the row and letter we're supplying to the function ties to the front end numbers. And then we can say again, it's .textFrame2 again, .textRange. And now when we're working with the font, it's font.fill, .forecolor, and then RGB. And we can set this to be RGB of white, which is the maximum value for each of the 3 numbers. The rest of the colouring we want to do is going to be based on the result. So we can say, okay, if the result equals 2, then this is where we want to paint it green. Else, if the result equals 1, and that will be yellow. Else, we'll paint it grey. And to do this, it's going to be again Wordle.shapes, row underscore letter, .fill, .forecolor, .rgb. And the green that I'm using for this is going to be the RGB 0, 210, 95. And then I'm just going to copy this row for each of these and then change those RGB values to a amber color, which I'm using as 2381810. And the grey color is 117 across all three. So we can test this out. So let's call paint letter, and let's say we were painting the P yellow. So it would be row 1, letter 1. The result would be, sorry, also 1 for yellow. No, and that hasn't quite worked. We're missing an equals somewhere. No, I think what we're actually missing is just the, I don't think we need the brackets for that. There we go. When you're calling a sub, you don't need brackets on it unless you use the keyword call. When you're calling a function, you always need the brackets, so that was the issue there. So that seems to work. Let's paint the second letter grey, just to check this is working. And then finally, let's paint the third letter green. Okay, so that seems to be working for each letter. So actually what we want to do is go through letter by letter. So we want to loop the 5 letters within the row and call this paint letter function for each one. So let's have a look at how to do that. Now really we want to do this between checking the guess and checking the game status. So let's create a counter and call it let's check. Oh, don't need to do that. And then we can say, okay, for let's check equals 1 to 5. And then we'll say next letter check. What we want to do here is we want to, so before we code this out, we're going to need another couple of variables. One is going to be the row that we are outputting to, so let's call that row out. And the second is going to be the row that our result is held on, so let's call that row result. And both of these, if we think about it, if we go to the calcs page, if we are on row 9, we know our row out is number 1, and we know our row result is 19. So let's have a think about how we would code that in. Our row out is going to be the calcs.range h9 dot value minus 8. So we know for row 9 we're going to be looking at row 1 on the output, and then our row result is going to equal the same number, so h9, and we know this one is plus 10 because we know for the guess on row 9 we're going to be looking at row 19 for the result, and for the guess on 10 we're going to be looking at row 20 for the result. So now when we call our function for this, we're going to say, okay, let's call paint letter, and the row we're going to be giving it is row out. The letter we're going to be giving it is letter check, because this is going to be looping through 1 to 5. And the result we're going to be giving it is actually going to be calcs.range, or calcs.cells, because we want to be able to give it the, again, row result and letter check. Okay, so let's just clean this up slightly. So this is going to check the guess. This is going to paint the letters. This would be checking the game status. The one other thing we are going to need to do is then paint the keyboard. Because obviously in Wordle, if we have a look on this, you can see the dark grey keys are the ones that are used and have been incorrect, and the green keys are the ones that have been used and are currently in the data. So let's first of all just test that this is working. I'm going to go with a new game. We've got gavel here. So let's use the word grain. And let's go back to our code and add in on our buttons the enter functionality. So this is just called enter key. And let's see if this then works. So actually we're going to enter grain on here, aren't we? So let's delete these and let's enter grain on the front page. Okay, that's copied to there, and then let's hit enter. Okay, so we've got the G in the right place, the A exists in the word, and the rest of the keys do not. So at least that is working well. We need to work on the animation so that these flick across one at a time. But apart from that, we're pretty much there. Right, so let's have a think about the keyboard painting. Let's create a new function called paint keyboard. And again, we're going to give it a row that we've just guessed. Which can just be an integer. And this is going to paint the keyboard a darker grey colour for the keys that have been unsuccessful. And we're going to say or green for letters that are in the word. We'll also use this to say, okay, if we're going to pass a 0, so if the 0 is passed, clear the keyboard. We may as well do that within this function because we're going to be looping through every single key, and we're going to need functionality to be able to reset the keyboard for a new game. So first of all, we can say, okay, if row guess equals 0, then we're going to clear the keyboard. Else, paint the keyboard. So what we want to do here is we want to loop through each of the key shapes, and we want to set the fill color. So we can do that by creating a shape variable. And then we can say for each shape in the active sheet, because this is going to be happening on the sheet that we've currently got active, and then we can say next shape. We want to say, okay, if the left of it, of its name, equals key, then paint the color. So essentially what we're doing here is we're singling out the keyboard keys. We know that the shapes up here do not start with the word key, so it will exclude them. It will only focus on the keyboard shapes. So for this, we want to say, okay, shape.fill color, sorry, .fill.for color, that's right, .rgb equals RGB 217, 217, 217. And that is the standard grey that we've got for these, this kind of light grey colour. Now for painting our keyboard, we're going to need a few additional variables. We're going to need the row result, that we're looking at. We're going to need the column number to loop through, and we're going to need the letter itself as a string. So we know, as before, that the row result is our guess row plus 10. Then, as we paint the keyboard, what we want to do is we want to loop through our columns. So let's say for the column equal 1 to 5, and then again next col. We essentially want to say here, if the value of the result row for this column is 0, then we want to colour it that darker grey. However, if the result row is 2, we want to colour it in the green colour. So let's go with, if the calculations.cells, so if row result and the column, which will be 1 to 5 as we're looping through here, equals 0, then else do something else. Because if it's not 0, it's either a 1 or a 2, and whether or not it's a 1 or a 2, we still want to paint that green on the keyboard. Because even if it's yellow on the board up here, it's still a green on the keyboard because we know that letter is part of the word. So when we're looking at it as a 0, we want to assign the letter to be the letter that we're currently looking at. So this, if we think about on the calcs page, if we're looking at this R as a 0, and we're looking at row 19, we want to take the R from up there. So we know that that is calcs.cells, and it's the row guess and the column. So now we know which key we want to fill in. So we can now say Wordle.shapes. We're going to reference the key by calling key and letter. And then we can say .fill, .forecolor, .rgb, and then this is going to be our grey colour, 117, 117, 117. And I've done something wrong there. Sorry, .rgb, that should then say equals RGB. There we go. Now otherwise we want to do exactly the same thing. Except this time we're going to use our green colour. So instead of 117, 117, we're using this colour here. So now we can go back up to our function of pressing the enter key, and we'll say, okay, we're going to paint the keyboard, and we would call paint keyboard. And let's see if that works. So to reset this, I'm just going to put this onto 9. That will automatically go to 6. We'll delete the result from there. We've already got grain entered. So now when I hit enter, we have not added the row that we're supposed to on here. So this is the row guess, so this should be our effectively row here. So let's add that in, and let's try that again. Okay, so we now get the A and the G, and the R, I and N are showing the darker colours. Okay, so before we go any further, let's create our functionality to clear all the board. We've already partly created that clear keyboard section, but what we'll also want to do is clear this board when we select new game. And again, we've already got most of the functionality for new game coded in. So let's take a look at our game section. And if we have a look at new game functionality, let's pretty much copy this and we'll put it on our UI page at the bottom. And then we'll delete it from new game so that we don't have a duplication in naming. So this does all the work for us on the back end. What we'll also want to do is all the work on the front end. And that is going to include clearing all guest letters, clearing the keyboard, and I think that's it. Clearing all guest letters will include clearing the colours of the letters. So for the letters, we know that we're going to need a guest number, a letter number, and we're also going to need to get or create the name of the shape that we're looking at. So what we'll do here is we'll say for guess 1 to 6, because we've got 6 rows to guess on. We'll say next guess. And then within each row, we want to cycle every single column or every single letter. So then we can say for letter equals 1 to 5. And then next letter. We can create the shape name from these two items. So the shape name will be the guess with an underscore and then the letter. And then we can use with Wordle.shapes and then reference the shape name. And then we'll have end with. And then we can specify what we want to do here. So this is going to be, first of all, let's set the text to be blank. And then secondly, we want to set the text color. So again, we'll go into the same way, text range, font, fill. We're going to reset it back to black. And then finally, we want to set the fill. Back to white. This with functionality just lets us, rather than having to write out Wordle.shapes.shapename every time and put it in the front of each of these, it just takes that as read for each one of these. So it's a good thing to use if you are changing multiple attributes of a single item so that you don't have to repeat this over and over again. So that should clear all our guest letters. Clearing the keyboard, all we need to do is call paint keyboard and give it a 0. And that should go through and clear the keyboard out. So now if we are to click new game, and for now I'm just going to press the play button up here so we can see it run. You can see it's cleared all the letters out and reset. And also if we go to the calcs page, it's also had the effect of clearing all the grids and resetting the numbers. So that's the new game functionality sorted out. Okay, so let's have a look at where we're up to now within the game. So let's say we've got a new game going here and we start with the word paint. Okay, so we know we've got a T and an I. And then if we say, okay, times, got the S, and we know, because I've already cheated and looked, that this word is items. We do that, we get you win, and it all goes green. So there's still a little bit of work to do, but the basics of the mechanics now are working. The first is to make the tiles turn over one by one rather than all the way at once, so that it works in the same way that Wordle works. And then the second is just to make everything look a bit nicer, so when you win the game, it pops up with a slightly nicer pop-up, and maybe add a title. We need to add in the new game or retry button on here. So let's firstly look at how we can get this animation piece working. The best way that animations work in Excel is using a time delay. So what I'm going to add in here is a function that's just called time delay, and we'll give it an argument of the delay amount as a long. And this will just delay time by calling doEvents, which is a functionality within Excel which effectively causes the processor to stop and do any events that are waiting. And that has the effect of holding up Excel for a certain amount of time. So we're going to call it multiple times. And the way we do this, we'll say, okay, dim I is long, I equals 1, and we're just going to do a little loop. So we can say, while I is less than the delay amount, loop, and then we'll just say, okay, I equals I plus 1, and for each version of I, we are going to do events. So now, when we paint our letters, so when we paint letters, what we'll do after each one, we will call time delay, and we'll give it maybe 5,000 and see how well that works. So let's try with paint. Now when we press enter, and that was a reasonable amount of time. We can obviously tick that up and tick that down. We could also do things like add a settings page where we can set the game speed. So you could have 5,000 as the base speed, and then you could have, a slide that moves it up so you're playing at 2x, 3x, or half speed. This will work differently slightly on different people's computers. So it's sometimes good to give the user that kind of flexibility so they can tailor the game speed. But for this version, we'll just have that game speed set at 5,000. That seems to work quite well here. Okay, so next up, let's create some custom pop-ups for when the user wins or loses. So let's do the win one first. For this, I'm going to create again a text box, or actually a shape. And once the user wins the game, we're just going to pop up something that says congratulations. So perhaps we'll have a box across here. And I'm just going to call this box endgame. And then within here, I'm going to copy one of these. And then I'm just going to spell out congratulations using these boxes. I'm also going to just group these so that we can reference them as a single object. And we'll just call it title congrats. And then I'm going to just hide that for a second. Ideally, I'll do exactly the same thing for an unlucky one. What we'll also need to do, though, if the user loses, is show them the word. So have a word reveal. So for that, let's copy an entire row here. And we'll move this down to the bottom. And let's just name these R1. And we'll group these as well. And just call it word reveal. And really we want those to be in our green colour as well. And that will be accompanied by another version of congratulations, except this one will say unlucky. And then again, we will group those so they can all be referenced as a single item. Call them title unlucky. And now it's just a case of, depending on the game status, showing or hiding these boxes. So let's take a look at that now. So on our game status, we can now do, okay, instead of the message box of you win, when a win happens, we want to show some of the shapes on here. So what do we want to show? We want to show title congrats and box endgame. We don't need to show the word reveal because the person will have already got the word. So let's just show those two things. So to reference those, we're going to say, okay, Wordle dot shapes. This is going to be box endgame. And then we'll say dot visible equals true. And then we'll do the same for our title congrats. Now for losing, we also want to show the box endgame. We want to show title unlucky. We also want to show the reveal word, but we'll also need to set the reveal word. So we called that word reveal. But before setting it, let's actually populate it. So we know that the word is in row 4. And we know that each of these letters is called R1 to R5. So all we need to do is loop through 1 to 5 and set those letters. So let's just add in an easy counter up here. And then we can say for I equals 1 to 5, we want to go with Wordle.shapes. It's going to be R and the number, which is referenced by I. And then we know this is text frame 2. Text range text is going to equal from the calculations page. We know it's row 4, and then it's going to be I for the column or letter number. The other thing we need to do is we need to hide all of this stuff when we run our new game function. So in fact, I'm just going to copy all of this stuff to make it a little bit easier. So after clear the keyboard, let's just say clear in-game boxes. And I'm just pasting everything from there. Obviously, a lot of this can be deleted. We don't need to loop through these to change what that says because it's going to be invisible. And we don't need box endgame twice. So I think those four cover all the possibilities of things that will be showing at the end of the game. So we can just set these each to be false. Okay, so now we've just got a few finishing touches to do. We'll add a title. We will add a new game button. So let's go to insert. Maybe we'll use an icon for this. Let's try. And then let's just add the macro to this, the new game macro. And then up at the top here, let's just add in a text box, and we'll have, I think before on this I used trebuchet. And then let's add a little Excel in the same way that we did before with the congratulations. I'm just going to have this little Excel logo at the top there. And then we'll delete this. I think we're pretty much done. So let's just have a look how this works at the moment. We'll do one where we get it right and one where we get it wrong to check it's all working correctly. And we can see that this is probably slightly too high now. I'll just move it to there. But now when we click replay, everything disappears. And let's just get this one wrong. Okay, so that seems to work. There are a couple of additional finishing touches that we could make to this. I'll probably just do that in a separate video because at the moment this is functionally all working. I don't want this video to go on for too much longer. And the pieces I'm thinking of are very much nice to haves, optionals. They're not required for Wordle here to work. I hope that's been helpful and informative. I know it's very long and quite complicated to get Excel working in a way like this. But it's something that I enjoy the challenge of, and hopefully if you've watched the video to this stage, that means you do too. If you've got any questions or comments, please put them down below. Drop a like if you've enjoyed the video, and please subscribe if you would like to see more of this kind of content. And I'll see you next time.